Bardzo się cieszę, że widzę tutaj.
Without any further ado, we'll get started. And I'm very pleased to see so many people here. I'm also very glad that Sara Rodowicz-Ślusarczyk has agreed to take part in our Gotong Royong side program. The lecture that she has prepared is part of a special program within the framework of a very rich public program that we've prepared, whereas Sarah's lecture is part of a block that we've prepared in the context or in relation to November 11th, Poland's Independence Day. Since yesterday, we've been looking at these subjects through various discursive forms, looking at different contexts of Independence Day, which for a number of years in Poland, rather than being a celebration of a shared heritage and social togetherness, has pointed to social divisions. Gotong Royong is a collection of different communal actions from all over the world. And we believe that art can be a tool of community building. That's how we want to view it. And communal action is something that we very much want to support and inspire through these presentations, through these lectures. We are also conscious that communities do get built on both sides of the divide, of the barricade, so to speak, and that's also something that we want to look at. So I'm very happy to have Sarah with us, and I can't wait for her lecture. Thank you very much, Marianna. Thank you to you for coming. The context of the exhibition that Marianna has cited relates to the notion of community. By definition, it presents various types of marks and records of what people do and can do together. The title that I've picked for this lecture is about what unites and what divides. So this evening I would like to reflect on how that which connects is also related to that which divides, often in unexpected ways. This notion, this question also feeds into the notion of community, so my point of reference will both be theory and clinical practice, my own practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which always refers to the individual subject. There is no such thing as group psychoanalysis in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Ever since the time of Freud, the first great psychoanalyst, psychoanalysts have asked about civilization as the source of discontents. The famous text by Freud, Das Unbehagen in dem Kultur. In German, Kultur doesn't only refer to culture, but also to civilization. It's a very interesting text, and I highly recommend it to you. It's a classic, which is rarely read, like many classics. At any rate, there is something at play here. Why do psychoanalysts ask about civilization as a source of discontents, of suffering? It seems to entail a risk. A risk and that relates to a general judgments, a generality that relates to collectivity, culture, and civilization. So if I speak today from the viewpoint of a certain body of knowledge about human action, the risk is that I might be tempted to present psychoanalysis as a type of science or morality. But this assumption, these connotations, might give us a wrong image of the experience of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is not a worldview, and in spite of the richness of its theory, it is not a philosophical system nor a type of sociology, and we might even question whether it's a science at all. And Freud's idea, and Freud believed in the scientific character of psychoanalysis, and nevertheless, he imagined psychoanalysis as a completely new area of human action, of human endeavor. So if I'm asking about what connects and what divides, and about the illnesses that are related to this, the discomforts, then through the very act of questioning and the emphasis placed on questioning, I come a bit closer to what people experience when they go through psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis being a constant questioning of oneself, asking oneself questions. I am taking up this subject, however, because I believe that psychoanalysis has political consequences insofar as psychoanalysis transforms the relation of the individual to people, to life, and to the world in a potentially radical way. The political nature of those changes stands for the political character of psychoanalysis, but this is by no means a direct correlation. Psychoanalysis is not merely an individual process, but it also takes place on a one-by-one basis. To me, these two things are linked. So, first of all, this potential, this political, indirect political potential of psychoanalysis is linked to the fact that psychoanalysis treats the subject one by one. So any effort to make psychoanalysis a mass event is contrary to its discourse, because that would make psychoanalysis into a master discourse. And I will go into what a master discourse is further on. Or even worse, if we make psychoanalysis a product, it becomes part of the capitalist discourse. As some of you may know, that Lacan introduced different session times and even different fees into his psychoanalytical practice, which to me really does express this focus on individuality. So when I claim, and here I follow Freud and Lacan, that psychoanalysis is not a worldview, it's also important that this is not a search for an alibi or a type of conformism, passing certain things over in silence. It's when we speak as a psychoanalyst, we have to take into account people's political views. It's true that psychoanalysis is not a worldview, and this relates to how psychoanalysis emerged. Keep in mind that it's a new subject matter. Freud spoke of Weltanschauung, the German for worldview. I apologize for my German. The way he defined it, Weltanschauung is an intellectual construct that solves all the problems of our existence in a uniform fashion through a single hypothesis and potentially leaves no question without an answer. So everything can be placed within a Weltanschauung. Universalism is part of science. As such, in the notion of scientism, there's always a goal that is in the future, the goal of grasping the whole universe through a certain type of knowledge. Universalism, including the universalism of science, is something that connects in a way. Everything can be studied by science, but what is the role of psychoanalysis? The universality of science presupposes objectivity or impersonalness. The goal of science is to be objective, thus the subject and the individual are excluded. Meanwhile, Freud discovered psychoanalysis by working with certain symptoms, certain bodily ailments that could not be explained away using the scientific discourse of medicine. And these were various kinds of symptoms. One example that I can cite is unexplained paralysis of different body parts. Impossible to explain on medical grounds because knowing what the neurological connections are, medicine has no way of explaining why a certain body part has grown stiff, whereas other parts of the limb are not. Some of the first patients that Freud treated had such ailments. And I think it's important that back in those times, at the turn of the century, those symptoms were typically located in the body, specifically the female body, because Freud's patients, many of them were women. Freud decided to interpret these hysteric symptoms as a type of, as expressing a type of truth. And he did not say that these ailments were a lie or pretense. It's as if he were saying, even if someone is pretending from the medical point of view, that pretense expresses a certain kind of truth. And that truth, let me tell you, has turned out to be much more complex than merely somebody trying to get attention, grab others' attention by being sick. And the truth that Freud discovered by asking his patients was a type of unpleasant jouissance, a type of excitement that went hand in hand with those ailments. A symptomatic jouissance, and jouissance is a Lacanian term that we continue to use. Because enjoyment or a joy has positive connotations, whereas jouissance not necessarily so. Nor does psychoanalysis stop at banalities, such as that you can derive masochistic pleasure from illness, or you can derive gains, advantages. This seems to be banal. But psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis departs from looking for the truth about that dark jouissance that the subject repeats in their symptoms. And the symptoms are not limited to the body. They can be certain repetitive mechanisms, repetitive thoughts, obsessive thoughts. So by studying symptoms, it turns out that symptoms and suffering carry traces of a connection with different events and figures in the individual's life. I find it very interesting. On the one hand, we have the discourse of science, which connects by unifying on condition of excluding certain idiosyncrasies or trying to make those, to interpret those idiosyncrasies via theory, via knowledge. On the other hand is the idiosyncrasy, which simply shatters the scientific paradigm. And there we find a different type of connection. The suffering of the subject turns out to be related to the personal story. Just as an aside, let me add that the category of the subject is extremely important to psychoanalysts. The subject is somebody who's always responsible for their position, including their suffering, which is paradoxical, thanks to the notion of responsibility for something that we have no control of, essentially, which is the paradox. But thanks to that responsibility, we can emancipate ourselves from thinking in terms of psychopathology and from determinism. That it's all a result, that we are a victim of certain events which have caused our suffering. That's not what a psychoanalysis says. A responsibility for our own suffering makes us work on, makes us extract, seek knowledge about the events that have been impressed in our body. It also allows us to look for the connection between the subject and others. It's a strange kind of knowledge which has nothing to do with power. Power is important for social bonds. It's a knowledge that lives in the subject. The subject has it, but doesn't always know it. Another paradox. Since I'm talking about knowledge, I would like to emphasize that the whole discourse and theory of psychoanalysis has nothing to do with the individual knowledge that psychoanalysis seeks. And there is no need to know psychoanalytic theory in order to psychoanalyze yourself.
Right. So we could actually say that psychoanalysis begins with a symptom. It begins with that which splits or divides the scientific discourse, something that is aside of this discourse, does not want to explain itself. And Lacan talked about it directly. He said that the discourse of psychoanalysis begins in a very specific moment of our civilizational development, and it comes out of what is actually rejected from the dominant discourse. I am using the term discourse, and perhaps let me elaborate on it, because the discourse is the foundation of social connections. For Lacan, the different modes of discourse determined the different interpersonal human relations used to maintain different types of bonds and ties. And every single person takes part in many different discourses in life. They overlap, they influence each other. We participate in different modalities of social bonds, though there are also people who stay outside of any social bonds. This word discourse, discursus in Latin, it means to run to and fro. This etymology shows us that in a discourse, or a discourse that contains a certain movement, motion, dynamics. Lacan sees four different types of modalities of such a discourse, and in each of these modalities, the discourse runs across 4 points. The theory of discourses is complicated. I am now researching or exploring it again, and I would not want to introduce here notions that are overly complicated or too much a theory, but I think it's very interesting that there are these 4 points. Let's think about it. It's about entering social relations, how our bonds or ties are constructed. The idea is such that there is a certain movement encapsulated in it, and that this movement runs across certain points. Let me tell you about it, a few things. First of all, there is this thing which is hidden, and it wants to express itself, and it remains pretty much excluded or perhaps denied, but it still needs to be answered to. It's the place of the hidden truth. Secondly, there is something or someone who is at the steering wheel of this discourse, at its surface, and who manages the expression of the hidden truth that he fails to see. And thirdly, by expressing, he directs or addresses the other so that the other could produce something or work something. And this is the fourth place. And on top of it, the final product is again trying to link with what managed the discourse and stayed on its surface. The discourse of the master. This is one of the most basic discourses, and Lacan derives this from the master and slave, maître, the same as master in French, though we talk about the discourse of the master in terms of the champion and not master in terms of the somebody superior. So what are the motions or movements and relations in the discourse? Now, the fact that the truth is hidden, it makes the subject divided. It sounds a bit mysterious. So again, we have a hidden, divided subject, and we have the dominant character of the master, and the authority of the master manages and controls the work and production, including the production of knowledge, in which then the figure of the master is trying to assimilate and enjoy. The discourse of science is a variant of the master's discourse. So what is hidden in this discourse is the truth of the authority, the expression of which is knowledge. So knowledge is there on top, it manages. On the surface, it manages. It's a command or order, and it controls who is supposed to absorb this knowledge. Due to the fact that the knowledge of science is neutral, subjectless, it makes us all be included in it or link up with it. There is no possibility in the discourse of science not to follow the command continue no more, evermore. The hidden command, the command which is related to knowledge, is this domination, is being dominated by knowledge. But as I have mentioned, Freud discovered psychoanalysis when he started dealing with the types of systems that could not be justified or explained by the discourse of science. Hysterics that produce these symptoms is also a structure of discourse. There is the hysterical or hysteric discourse. What is hidden in this type of discourse is the fact that there is an object of ecstasy, that there is some kind of an ecstasy. But the expression of the truth, what manages this discourse, is the divided subject, to which I shall return later, a sort of a symptom, a suffering, something that does not work. This symptom manages, it's at the steering wheel, and it addresses its protest to the master, questioning the position of authority so that the master could produce a new knowledge. These two discourses, that of the master and that of hysterics, are very important for the political world. The master's discourse is necessary for there to exist some kind of an order and some kind of an order in the world, whereas the hysterical or discourse of hysterics relates to all sorts of different protests, questioning, and the questioning of the master's discourses, which always have the risk of slipping into tyranny. I think that each and every one of us can actually relate to these discourses to the immediate events around us, be it political or social. Analytical discourse is also a sort of a social tie that also results from the practice of psychoanalysis. And it is in these categories that we should understand analytical discourse. It's not all the text and all the books about psychoanalysis. Lacan wanted for the analytical discourse to be given a value. He said that he juxtaposed it with the fundamental ties, the discourse of the master, the discourse of the science, which is a variant of the former one, and the discourse of hysterics, because he said that these were the absolutely most fundamental ties that we can actually practice in life and which are feasible in life. Right. So the question is about ties, about social ties. And I would also like to mention here a text by Freud, which is very old. It's the psychology of the collective and the analysis of ego, in which he examines the relation between how the psychology of the individual is built, particularly in reference to the notion of the ego, and then how it is later reflected in the collective. It's a text in which Freud ponders on ties. What is it that connects? What makes people be together in a group? He says, he talks about, or he gives two examples of an organized community, church, and the army, and these are organized collective, so with a very strong figure of a leader. But he also says that when there are communities without a leader, there may also be a certain idea replacing the position of the leader. For example, if we talk about the fact that the discourse of the master is what combines a certain community together, then when law and the constitution are an important value, there needn't be a figure of the master for there to be something in the position of the master, something that needs to be observed, something that should be binding. In any case, when Freud thinks of what connects people, puts them in communities, and when he thinks about the ties of individuals or between individuals, he notices that there is a certain division in a subject. For example, he talks about love ties. And he also says that oftentimes in a relationship with the love object, what happens is that the subject has to either humiliate the object of love or humiliates his or her own self for the object of love. So we see here that in this tie there is something peculiar happening with this ego and the ties of the ego. And when we think about ties in a group, there may be mechanisms of suggestions to which people succumb. He also talks about copy catting or imitating. And he also says that the most strong form of a tie is identification, the possibility to identify oneself with a group. Well, the question of identification is something which is what makes, what ties, what connects, but also what divides. I would like to talk about it from the point of view of how psychoanalysis was later developed by Lacan. Lacan was the one who insisted on using the notion of a divided subject. And he said that it wasn't a question of anything pathological or anything that was a shortcoming of a subject, that it was divided, but it was a question of the subject structure, that this is how a subject is created, by division or being divided. Now, how does that work? How does that happen? For those of you who've listened to different speeches on psychoanalysis, this perhaps may sound like a repetition when I say, or when I quote, the very famous face of the mirror that was invented by Lacan. However, I will repeat it again, and I will mention it again. The face of the mirror is a concept of development, of the formulation of the ego, the formulation of the subject, which happens at an early stage of its childhood, between the 6th and the 18th month of a person's life. And it is connected with two phenomena that also take place in parallel. First of all, the child cannot control its body. The child's body is fragmented. It cannot be, it is not coordinated in any way. Secondly, the child's perception is quite well developed already, and the child is treated as a certain entirety by the other. The other wants to assign a certain identification to it, but the child also sees its own reflection, something that it sees as finite, as defined and contained. So the child experiences a certain tension of a joyous anticipation that indeed it is there, it is the image, and that it is growing up to catch up with the image. But on the other hand, there's also the feeling of a danger, a fear that it does not adhere to this picture, this image, and that it is fragmented. There's this idea that one has to find a representation for itself, find an identification of itself, and that is a condition, a precondition to live, to function. One has to learn how to treat one's body as a unity, though there are also those who have big problems with that. Only that here we come across the following situation, namely, it is never possible to simply bridge the gap between something what is the lively, carnal ecstasy, jouissance, and the virtual one, first perceived with the sight of sense of sight, but a perceived representation of self. And this is quite an interesting phenomenon. Somebody called it child transitivism. A child who hits another child says, "Oh, he hit me." It's not a question of a lie, and it happens at a very early stage of development. And seeing a child trip and fall, the other child seeing this starts crying. So here we see that the famous a verse by Rimbaud, "I is somebody else," is very well verified. So identification makes it possible for one to actually enter into a bond, enter into a tie with the family, namely a social realm. So identification does give us a certain benefit, a certain control, a certain pleasure, a narcissistic triumph when we feel in line with our own image. It's nice, it's pleasant. Identification can also introduce an order. Yes, an order in the social relations. For example, we can define what the social group we belong to, also on the basis of the lifestyle that we identify ourselves with. But identification also strips us of something. It's like when we say that language is the death of things. Here, it's not just about language. I think that we are even before language. It's that something acquires the capacity to represent us. So identification strips us of something, deprives us of something. But it's like in the song, we don't know that we have something until we lose it. And one's own identification, the image of oneself as an object, mixes up in one's head with the impression that that something's been lost, the lack, the absence, generating a desire for it. I said that what is lost is ecstasy, is being a living substance at a level that evades symbolization. In the life of a subject when it's growing up is that the strictly sexual ecstasy seems to be forbidden when he's a child. It's a taboo, and it's not about upbringing methods. It's about the fact that in the exchange with the parent, there is a certain pleasure which is banned, which is forbidden, for example, which is not spoken about, or when it's spoken explicitly, when there is an attempt by an adult to seduce a minor. But it's something which is not allowed. And for that reason, the strictly sexual ecstasy is something which becomes a certain promise, if you will, a promise for the child. and that is something that much is expected from. It's like the absolute ecstasy, which is deferred, which is delayed. Once one reaches maturity, adulthood, it's something that becomes specific, a specificity about thinking about absolute ecstasy that one would like to unite with. It's an ecstasy which is forbidden, and it's also something that had been lost before from his own being. This idea that there is a certain absolute ecstasy would mean that one would desire to finally unite with oneself. And it turns out that absolute ecstasy simply does not exist. Right. So what happens in collective identifications? What happens in brotherhood that was mentioned here in an introduction to this lecture, namely that brotherhood is based on a specific mechanism of segregation. It turns out that brotherhood of the members of a particular group is something, and here we come across a mythical Freudian construct, the totem and taboo, that brotherhood is based on the mechanism of limitation. This absolute ecstasy that does not exist but can be imagined is given over by the members of the group to the figure of the leader, even if the leader is dead or it's an empty space. For example, a guru or a former authority. Freud said that the members of the group are able to sacrifice, and the structure of the subject defines reflection in how one lives in a group. Because what is the ideal of the ego, of the I, of the self, is now given over to this external figure who is supposedly superior and has special rights, whereas brotherhood is based on the notion of equality of the members, but this equality also encapsulates or contains a ban that it's not allowed to walk to be ahead of others. Brotherhood is also important in relation to the others beyond brotherhood. Segregation means separating oneself from other groups or from who starts making chaos within a group, causing chaos within a group or causes commotion within a group. In the introduction to this lecture, there was a certain premonition, prediction from 1973. I use this word because it is more about the style and the tone in which Lacan said these words, though it is difficult to actually say that this particular prophecy has not actually come true, that we're not actually seeing intensified racism. He said that our future of common markets will find an equilibrium in the ever stronger expansion of processes of segregation. So he talked about it some 30, 40 years ago, and he talked about the future of common markets, something that's already a fact today. And he also thought that the fact that we would witness this globalization, that this would have consequences in the form of processes of segregation. And I would like to talk about it not from the vantage point of a sociologist or a historian, but I would like to say why we could actually speak about these consequences now, and how and are we able to explain it via psychoanalysis? Because what do we see happening via the effects of globalization? Effects of globalization, for example, lead to a situation that we mix more and more with each other, and thus we see the mixing of the different modes of the jouissance. If, for example, if a type of jouissance is a lifestyle. If a lifestyle which is connected with a certain culture, always a certain culture, different lifestyles and different types of jouissance is something that had its ideals, that had its modes of building identification in groups, and this was something that was always inscribed in a certain order. Let's say the order of culture, and it was thus sanctioned by the so-called the great other, the symbolic order. Before globalization, these modes of life, so very different from each other, they would not mix with each other. They would not come across themselves, or come across each other, rather. But when their diversity begins being mixed, then it seems that the other, the guarantor, the discourse of the master, which is assigned to each of these modes, loses its consistency, cohesion, thus evoking a threat to identification. On the other hand, capitalism, which is irrevocably connected with globalization, sees every ecstasy as fine as long as it can be transformed into a product of consumption, and it does not have to respond or relate to any symbolic or cultural ideals. I think that we're all aware of the fact that how limits of what could happen an object of consumption and possible objects of ecstasy are constantly tested and extended. In terms of capitalism, well, Lacan even questioned whether it could be a discourse. If a discourse is to be building ties, then there is something problematic about a capitalist discourse. There is no bond there. The bond or the ties are reduced to the relationship subject and the object of consumption, though it is not entirely clear who or which is what. Racism and the effect of segregation are to an effect linked to the expansion of the capitalist discourse and the plague of identification. If there's anything in us that makes us or forces us to identify ourselves, if there's something in us that make our identifications ever less consistent or cohesive, it's not surprising that such an effect is produced. And every single new identification can also become an object of consumption. So why not multiply these segregations, these differences, if this gives potentially ever more types of products, if a certain lifestyle can actually become a product? What is difficult to bear by the contemporary subjects, as practice tells us, is this nature of this infinite offer of ecstasy or jouissance with the different repercussions. Addictions on the one hand, on the other hand, depression or resignation. The inability to catch up ever with this infinite jouissance. Possibly because so as to try and fine-tune the relations between the subject and the ecstasy or jouissance, hence references to different masters and authorities, or even the darkest corners of religion, darkest sides of religion, which, contrary to the discourse of science, gives not knowledge, but gives a certain sense. Right, so these are the dark times. And here a question arises about the place of psychoanalysis in these times. Question about brotherhood, because Lacan proposed, or Lacan said that there was a certain solution to the capitalist discourse, whether it's a solution that's uncertain, because capitalism is born where, or it ends where it actually starts. Namely, now coming to brotherhood, though he said that the only source of brotherhood is segregation, he also talked about a different brotherhood, Lacan did. he talked about the so-called discrete brotherhood. Now, I'm wondering, what could that mean? Perhaps it's a brotherhood that does not announce its identification. A discrete brotherhood has to describe the connection between the psychoanalyst and the person being psychoanalyzed. This discrete brotherhood stems from the fact that one is a speaking entity, an animal which has an illness of the tongue. Namely, it's a recognition that a subject is always divided, that it seeks its identification because they are needed, but at the same time it is limited. When I spoke about the division of the subject, we could also mention how Lacan's psychoanalysis is different from other schools of psychoanalysis, and also the psychoanalysis of the ego, which strives for this division of the subject to be eliminated and thus strengthen the ego, and thus also being part of the master's discourse. In the case of Lacan's discourse, entering it is not easy because it cuts across or goes against the current of identification. It requires a certain tact on the part of the psychoanalyst. It also requires an acceptance of that by the person being psychoanalyzed. And if indeed this is what happens during psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis does give us something new, and it activates this revelation, then it shows that if we go against the current, then the paths of identification are paved. There is a desire that kind of causes a gap in the identifications that were there thus far. A desire that is related to the act, but also a desire that has to be with fear. The element of risk and the element of fear is always the other side of desire. To put it in simple terms, we could also say that psychoanalysis gives the possibility for one to forget about oneself, forget about one's ego. When it opens up the field of desire, it opens up also the field of activity to which we can succumb. It's not about ideals such as that of altruism that gives one a certain perception of oneself. It's more about drawing on the feeling of absence, of the lack of satisfaction. A feeling which is very much an indispensable part of the human condition. That's the idea of psychoanalysis, that this lack, this absence should be the driving engine of one's desires. Psychoanalysis gives one the possibility to learn one's desire as a sort of a symbolic debt. Symbolic, namely something which does not boil down to money, but a debt that can even be desired, that one can even want. How is it possible? How can one want a debt not wanting to get rid of it? It happens when we desire, when we follow a certain, how can I put this? If we have something to do in our life and with our life, when we do this, we become the other to ourselves. It's a type of a debt, the final payment of which we don't have to care about, apart perhaps from the time that we have left in life. It is a sort of individual approach to desire, and this is something that also creates or makes it possible to have a certain distance to this cultural super ego. It doesn't have to mean being giving up on the mundane ecstasies, but it does relieve us of this order of ecstasy and jouissance. and connecting it with one's representation, because this representation or presentation of oneself is becoming less significant. Desire, on the other hand, is something that can combine, that can connect. We say that the desire is always a desire for the other, and it means that it is possible to include in our desire others, include others in our desires. And with that, I end. Thank you very much. And yes, it is possible also technically for us to have a discussion if you feel like it. Thank you.
Mówiła pani, jak już działa? Halo? Mówiła pani, że źródłem jak gdyby braterstwa jest segregacja.
That segregation was at the root of brotherhood, and at least that's what I've understood. Can we say that in order for there to be a connection between people, there needs to be a division of sorts? Is that viable? That's an important question, and I'm wondering about it myself, whether there can be a bond that does not contain division. It's like with the discrete brotherhood, or a bond that comes from desire. Is it possible at all for there to be a bond that does not include division? Can you have desire without lack? No. I'd like to ask about something that you said at the very beginning. You said it at the beginning, and at the end you repeated it. And namely that psychoanalysis started with looking at symptoms in the female body, and we ended with brotherhood. Does Lacan say anything about the social experience of women and not of men? When we say brotherhood, we mean brothers, and so men. I've been wondering about it myself, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know of any passages in Lacan when he'd be writing of sisterhood or communities of women. I'm not sure if he ever addressed this, so I simply don't know. Lacan did indeed work on the notion of womanhood in a different way than Freud, but it's complicated because it's a type of femininity that you could put in quotation marks. It's not related to anatomical sex. So-called female jouissance, according to Lacan, is something that is not part and parcel of social bonds. It's a type of ecstasy that you can say nothing about, aside from knowing when it happens. And it's not a jouissance that gives possibilities of identification. So this type of ecstasy is what he calls a feminine jouissance. Although, on the other hand, women are social are people, and they do form bonds. Another more important thing that might be even more to the point is that symptoms in female bodies, the individual corporeity, and the feminine was rejected from the dominant discourse in the time of Freud. Nevertheless, the symptoms that Freud speaks of related to the hysterical complex, which occurs more often in women, though not exclusively. And what is typical of hysteria is that it builds bonds because it addresses the master. So, for instance, if we speak of questioning master figures in political movements, this is a type of questioning whose underlying purpose is nonetheless to preserve the bond. So that is one thing that comes to mind. Lacan also differentiates the hysteric position, the hysteric discourse, from the so-called female position. And he even asked himself to what extent the so-called female joy, female jouissance, was something desirable, because his thesis was that it did not guarantee a permanence of bonds, that it somehow ran counter to bonds, that pursuing this kind of impermanent jouissance actually ruined bonds. Does male jouissance, is it part of bonds? I would say that it's part of something that is more universal, part of a certain uniformity, of a certain universalism. Male, again, in quotation marks, so-called phallic jouissance related to sensuality, to language, to meaning. And I emphasize the fact that I'm putting these words in quotation marks. This is essential for Lacanian psychoanalysis. First of all, thank you for giving us a lecture on everything. My question is about so-called post-truth, fashionable concept of late. So it's post-truth being the dissemination of information which is not always related to, it's not always factual, and such information might lead to Donald Trump being elected or somebody else being lynched. And these information is disseminated by a sort of right-wing community. There's also trolling, and that gives people pleasure. How can we relate these to the Lacanian discourse? Are these hysteric actions? Are they master narratives? It's possible that it's a bit of everything. I can't give you a single interpretation. I'm not. But post-truth seemingly says that anything that you say can be truth, can become truth. Words have a power. They become truth as soon as they're spoken. As for what kind of discourses post-truth figures in, I can't tell you. I would like a clarification of one thing. Regarding the subject that becomes the master, who can be an idea or a figure. So how is it that you maintain a master via a group of different subjects that raise somebody to that position? Is anointing a master something essential, something irreversible in the process of forming bonds? Is it necessary to have a master for there to be bonds? I think so, yes, but it's not the only type of bond. It is reversible, as different revolutions and protests show. There's always a dynamic between the master discourse and the hysteric discourse. What about figures that refuse to be masters? They resign. They refuse, and I think to a large extent Lacan was also tried to resist being made into a master. So on the one hand, the mechanism of what makes a master is that mechanism a model that you can follow for creating a master? Is there a need, or do we have masters because there's a need for them, or is it that somebody becomes a master and they draw a group of people to them? They attract people to themselves. So what comes first? The master or the group? It goes both ways. I don't know what comes first. I can't tell you everything. I can't explain everything, but I think experience and observation shows that there's usually need for a master. And I'm thinking of a quote. I don't want to do it, but I have to become president. But there are other figures who are more like imposters, and they become masters of sorts. And who is outside of bonds? You said there were different types of interhuman relations, or interhuman bonds, but is there anyone who stands outside bonds? There are certain people, psychotic people, for example, who are outside all social bonds. Outside discourse. Do such people go shopping, or do they sit at home? What is their life like? How do psychotics manage? Psychosis is simply a structure, and within psychosis, you can have different types of human existence. If this is a person who is outside of discourse, they do not enter into permanent or more permanent structures or types of exchange. Even if they go shopping, their behavior does not necessarily end up being an exchange or a discourse or a bond. I think we would need to look at a specific case, because what we're analyzing is not behavior as such, but the experience of behavior, what it's like to be that person, what kind of discourse do they have. Is the individual the same thing as the subject? No. It's true, I wasn't very precise on this point. When it comes to the difference between the two, the individual is not the same thing as the subject. Peter Sloterdijk notes that every birth is a double birth, namely, we are born as a pair, and he calls it the with and the also. So there's something that is with us and something that accompanies us throughout life, which seems to be similar to the mirror phase that you mentioned, although the mirror phase doesn't seem to be a duality, more than the subject is usually double, is always double. So the with and the also is what connects us, or what makes us part of different structures, what gives us a sense that we are with someone or that we are also something. Is it similar to the mirror phase? I won't try to pretend that I'm an expert on Peter Sloterdijk, even if I've read some of his writings. I think there might be a parallel, but I think there's probably a difference there as well. So I'm not really sure how to answer the question. When we say that the subject is double, so there are two, versus the divided subject, is not the same thing. Is the subject the same as the individual? No. The individual is... and Lacan didn't like the word individual. But it's not the same thing. So we have the subject, which has its own ego or self-image. And from this, because of this very fact, the subject is divided. But it's not that there are two. There are not two. You said that psychoanalysis runs counter to identification, and I can't really understand it. Maybe you could give an example of how the person being psychoanalyzed, as far as I understand, they are sort of trying to escape their identification. And could you give an example? For example, the symptom that you come with into psychoanalysis, it's not ready-made. It emerges in the course of analysis. We have an increasingly better grasp of what the symptom is about. And the symptom is not something that is equal to our self-image. The self-image is something that we would like to have, that we would like to be. We would like to identify with the self-image. Meanwhile, the symptom that we are experiencing is something that just shatters that. We cannot assimilate it into that image. But it's not, nor is it that or to put it differently, to run counter to one's self-image requires tact and agreement on the part of the person being analyzed. it may be that for somebody, because of their own story, their family story, their ideals, this person might come to the conclusion that family relationships are not important for me at all, and they identify with this view. So this is their self-image that they've produced. I've never wanted a family, it was never my priority, it's not important to them. And meanwhile, in the course of analysis, it may turn out that their life revolves around family, regardless of the idea that they have. The thing that keeps troubling them, the thing that is continually bothering them is the family and family relationships. So this is just an example. Somebody might imagine themselves as being able to become friends with everyone, to communicate with everyone, and they believe that is a vital part of their identity. It's pleasant, it's nice to be able to get along with everyone until something happens and there's a situation that proves that wrong, or even shows why this person is after trying to get along with everyone. So, until somebody goes into psychoanalysis, it may be that they believe their self-image to be true, and maybe their self-proclaimed identity is a symptom. Yes, definitely. That's precisely it. In that case, thank you to everyone for the questions and remarks.